Today we're talking about attachment, which is the really strong and powerful bond that connects infants to their caregivers. Think about this from an evolutionary perspective, a survival perspective, right? It's important to keep infants and caregivers close to one another. So we've evolved to form these very strong emotional bonds with our caregivers very early on in infancy. Think about a little kid, maybe even you did this when you were younger. Um, did you have any kind of like stranger anxiety, or did you have anxiety when you were separated from a parent? When you knew that a caregiver would have to go somewhere and you weren't sure when they were going to be back. We see this really strong attachment bond in children when a 1 year old, for example, would cling really tightly to their parent when they're scared or when they know that the caregiver may need to go somewhere. So we know that there's this really strong bond between caregiver and child, and our goal for today is to, I guess, define that bond a little bit more and talk about the basis of it. Margaret and Harry Harlow are two researchers who, back in the 1950s, actually set out to prove what was called the cupboard theory at the time, the notion that the basis for attachment is that the caregiver is a food source, the idea that an infant will attach to whoever is feeding them. That's what they set out to prove, but during the course of their research discovered it's actually bodily contact, or what we call contact comfort, that is the basis for this attachment. In working with baby monkeys who had been separated from their mothers, the Harlows noticed that they had placed the monkeys in cages with these blankets. They noticed when the blankets were taken away to be washed, the babies became very, very upset. And so they started to think, well, maybe it's actually comfort. Maybe it's physical comfort. Maybe it's tactile comfort that is the basis for this kind of attachment that makes these monkeys feel comforted. So they set out to test this theory that perhaps this fundamental cause of attachment is in fact contact comfort and not a food source. I'm going to have you watch some footage of this research. You're going to see how the Harlows did their research, where they essentially constructed a cheesecloth. I'm sorry, they constructed a terry cloth mother who was covered with a very soft fabric, and then they constructed a wire mother who was simply a food source. As you can see here, the only thing that the monkey would gain from attaching to this mother would be to eat. And what the Harlows found is that these orphan monkeys that they were working with, they were placed in cages with these two surrogate mothers. Again, one just the food source or the cupboard, and the other physical comfort. The monkeys spent much more time with the terry cloth mother than they did with the food source. And if they were going to go off and explore their environment, they would immediately be drawn back to the terry cloth mother. The terry cloth mother became a safe base for the monkeys, and they would only go to the wire mother that was the food source when they needed to eat. We see this in human infants as well. I don't know if you've ever heard, but people who will volunteer in NICUs, the neonatal ICUs, they'll sit there and they'll just snuggle the preemies because their parents can't be there in the hospital with them 24/7. So they'll snuggle them and they'll rock them. And we also have seen evidence of what neglect, severe neglect, can do to children who are not touched, who are not held, who are not cuddled. That can lead to some really severe developmental delays in children. So again, human infants have the same need for physical touch and physical contact that the Harlows first really were proving when they were doing their research with monkeys back in the 1960s. So in addition to contact comfort, another basis for attachment is familiarity. I want you to think back to our learning unit when we talked about the fact that the more we see someone, the more we see anything, the more we like it, right? The mere exposure effect. We see that again in how attachment occurs as well. An example of this, though not in humans, but in bird species, is what is called imprinting. Imprinting is when infants of certain species, again, especially birds, will attach onto, or in this case, imprint onto, the first moving object or individual that they see. Konrad Lorenz is the researcher who we know for having done research in this imprinting process. And he found that he had a procedure that he used, but essentially what happened is that he was able to have groups of ducklings imprint onto him and follow him around as though he was their mother, simply because he was the first moving thing that they saw. Now again, children, unlike ducklings, do not imprint, but there is, just like with these ducklings, there was a critical period for their attachment. In other words, again, the first moving thing is what they'd imprint onto. There's also not a critical period, but they call it a sensitive period for human attachment. Okay, so again, this familiarity, in addition to the contact comfort that we just talked about, are two of the main bases that help children form attachment.